This is my Street Fighter II. It's in a Dynamo cab, and it's an original with CPS1 hardware. And you can see that it's the monitor is beautiful. Actually, it's pretty much a new monitor. It's when I found it, I compared it to everything else that I had, and it was absolutely the best monitor I've ever seen, in fact. And I have it dialed in perfectly, and it has hyper fighting in there. This is all original hardware, and I partially restored this with a nice control panel with a generic Capcom overlay. And this is one of my favorite machines with one of my top Street Fighter versions. This is another way to play Street Fighter here. This is a Namco No Ear clone. I call it the Clone Ear, and in it I have hyper fighting shown here, but it's running on a Raspberry Pi RetroArch, and it has scanlines kind of emulated in software so that I have the monitor looking as close to arcade hardware as possible. Here's another thing, which is actually a arcade monitor that can take a medium resolution 640 by 480, and that has a Xbox 360 in there. And that's another version of hyper fighting. And this is also another way to play Street Fighter. This is the Arcade1Up 3 games in one machine. It's got Championship Edition, Super Street Fighter II, the new challenges, and Super Turbo. And so I am comparing all these different examples so that I can actually take a look at how it compares to original Sanwa joysticks in one version, Industrial Lorenzo competition joysticks with IL buttons as well, commonly known as HAP arcade controls, but they were reselling Industrial IL hardware. And here I have split the controls. On the left side I have actually updated it to have competition hardware to the original Arcade1Up joystick with a bat top on top, and I'm going to compare that with my Sanwa hardware all over here and give my thoughts on this Arcade1Up cab. The version that they put in there is a Championship Edition, so it's kind of like they put in a couple of the wrong versions, and it's very odd to me because they could have easily put in all of them, including World Warrior, even though there's almost no reason to play World Warrior. But they only picked 3 versions, and Super Turbo is definitely the right version. But if you're going to put in CE, you actually should have put in hyper fighting as well, because hyper fighting is better balanced and it also has a little bit of speed. So CE was kind of cheap, where a couple of characters were way overpowered. And so I'm going to be splicing together a bunch of videos on each of the examples and putting together my thoughts on this Arcade1Up and how they did with it. Hi, we're talking a lot about Street Fighter, but really, who am I and what makes me even qualified to talk about Street Fighter? I've been playing Street Fighter in the arcade since it first came out. I was one of those guys in college going to 7-Eleven and playing late at night. I eventually kind of grew out of it around the hyper fighting timeline, so I kind of skipped a couple of versions with new challenges and Super Turbo until I got back into it. While I was working in the video game industry, in and out, I switched to a lot of PC gaming for quite a while, but I got back into Street Fighter for Super Turbo because when I was working at Sony, PlayStation of America, a ton of us were actually really into it, and we played during breaks, and we got to a pretty high skill level. Guys were playing all different types of characters, so we played daily all the time. And I eventually also worked at Capcom, where I played a lot with the Capcom guys there, even though we weren't working on any of the Street Fighter properties. We were working on some console projects. So I've have a lot of friends that I've made friends with the guys from Evolution. I've been a supporter in the arcade collecting community with CAX in the Bay Area, spent all this time in the video game industry, so I want to take a lot of that experience and actually talk about this version of the 1UP arcade machine and how I think it should have been and how you can modify it to make it better and make it more authentic to something like this, which was the real release of Street Fighter II. This is my Street Fighter II machine. It's in a classic Dynamo. This is an HS2 with a 19-inch CGA monitor. CGA was the standard resolution arcade monitor back in the day. It is actually only 320 by 240 resolution. So they have these things called scan lines built into it so that it only draws every other. And so it, in effect, it's kind of smooths out the picture so that it looks more a little bit blurred. But here in this monitor, this is probably one of the best 19-inch monitors that I have. It practically is a brand new monitor when I put it in. Every monitor that I've looked at, arcade monitor, pales in comparison to this one because the contrast is perfect. There's no burn in. It just is super bright. All the colors are vibrant. The guns that shoot the electrons to the tube, it's just they're not old and corroded, and it just is a beautiful monitor. So by comparing all the examples of how to play Street Fighter II against this one, I can actually look at and see how it matches to the original arcade. This is also running a classic, an original Capcom CPS1 board. These boards, here's a CPS1 board. This is Hyper Fighting, but it's a board like this, and there's 3 boards sandwiched, and then this is Hyper Fighting. Hyper Fighting has a little different clock rate, and you can actually upgrade a CE board to a Hyper Fighting board by changing 3 chips that's on this middle board here. You can upgrade yours to Hyper Fighting. The clock rate's going to be a little bit different than an original Hyper Fighting board, but it is playable. Most people don't notice the difference there. This one's set to free play. And it's just actually beautiful. I have competitions in here. This is the right bullnose control panel. This is a standard generic speckle control panel that I got, control panel overlay that I got when I worked at Capcom, and I set this all in there. And so I'm comparing this to the Arcade1Up. So this is an anomaly here. It's a project that I'm working on. I'm going to set it up as an emulation machine, but I have a Dynamo HS1, and it takes a 19-inch monitor. And the old monitor that was in here was pretty faded and pretty worn. And I had a special monitor. It is a dual resolution monitor. It takes a CGA standard resolution, but it also goes up to 640 by 4080. There's a VGA connector on this monitor, so it takes a medium resolution signal also. So this is practically a brand new monitor. It was once a test monitor for Ultracade that was here local to this area, and someone had a contact over there and bought a bunch of hardware out of it. And so long story short, I got a hold of this monitor, and it was part of their test equipment. So it is fairly unused as a monitor, and so it looks practically brand new. All the colors are great on it. The brightness, there's no burn in. Everything's great on this monitor. So what I did was I plugged in my Xbox 360. So that, what I could do was compare a 640 by 480 resolution picture of the game running in emulation on Xbox 360 hardware, but it goes to a CRT monitor that does have scan lines built in. So it's a little bit higher resolution, so I can compare this example to my CGA original hardware example in my HS2 and compare that to other examples of these LCD examples that have scan lines or don't have scan lines, and I can compare the pictures side by side with all of them to built-in scan lines through a CRT monitor or emulated scan lines in these boards that will output to an LCD screen. So this is a emulation machine. It's a clone of a Namco Noir, which was the Tekken Bloodline cab, and it's a great cab. The monitor is a 32-inch 720p LCD screen, and it has a full open cab in the bottom where I can put in multiple boards, even more power supplies. I actually had a Xbox 360 in here originally, and my favorite games to play were Ultra Street Fighter 4, Championship Edition, no, Pac-Man CEDX Plus, which is great for the big monitor, and we even had the Xbox, the camera set up so that we can play Connect games on here. But recently I put in a Raspberry Pi 4 in here to really expand its repertoire of games and just play a lot of old school games on it, because I have been clearing out a lot of my JAMA boards. It has a JAMA harness that goes to the screen and everything. I have the screen plugged in directly to whatever board or console I put into it, but the JAMA harness is hooked up to all the controls and everything. So what I had done is hacked a fingerboard into the JAMA harness, and then from the fingerboard I had directly wired that to two USB Xbox 360 controllers, and then from there I plug those into the Xbox, or in this case the Raspberry Pi. What I like about this cab is it has front-facing speakers here, and it has a built-in amp, and it has some controls here. But what I'm able to do is flip this lever here and pull open the control panel. This is all full stamped steel, and I have Soundwave controls in it, and I have access to the back of the joysticks, and I'm able to swap the restrictor plates on these Soundwave joysticks to right now I have GTY octagonal plates, but here's the 4-way plate, which is actually it's an 8-way plate, but it's actually can be rotated 90 degrees to have a 4-way joystick. So when I play Pac-Man CEDX, what we do is we put in the 4-way in there, so you have direct up, down, left, right, and no diagonals. So it is a more of a true Pac-Man game in that sense. So I have volume knob, a couple of more coin access buttons in there, and I've actually hooked up this coin reject as a button also, so that's my credit button. The monitor is 32 inch, but if you run a 4x3 inch game format game, not 4x3 but aspect ratio, it turns out that this monitor is about it appears to be a 25 inch diagonal in 4x3. So when you have the letter boxes on the sides, or the jail bars, so I have scan lines kind of programmed in emulation here. This is a Raspberry Pi 4, so it has all the speed that I need for up to Naomi and Dreamcast games in here as well. This is the Arcade1Up. This is the Street Fighter edition, and it comes with the 3 games. You can find a bunch of videos online, and probably this video is late to market. I wanted to see for myself. I never was interested in it, and I decided to pick one up on a whim. I thought I might return it if it was a piece of garbage, but honestly, it kind of charmed me. I like the 3/4 scale. I thought it was cute. It is hard and a little bit cramped for 2 players to fit in it because of this width here. If you're centered, there's no way another player is going to be centered over here. So you're going to play skewed and over to the side, and also rubbing shoulders. But there's a lot to like about this. The emulation is fine. I've brought up Championship Edition here. I mean, I wish there was a light up marquee, but it's not that bad missing it. It was only $300. I think they're probably MSRP $400. And I wanted to go over and talk about some of the stuff I started to do to this to modify it. The first thing I did was I removed the little ball tops, and I put this bat top that I had on there. And I wanted to talk about what design decisions I thought that they made that were good and bad. A lot of the art and aesthetics I think is fine. The angle of the monitor is fine. The 3/4 scale is fine. I wish that they could have found a way to make the control panels a little bit wider, but I get why they made it so trim and so tight fitting here. It's because they want you to rack these up side by side and have a whole row of them. So they're not going to have an extended control panel that fits wider than what it is. They could have easily done it. They could have cut the sides a little deeper and then added a wider control panel, or just made so the control panel plate and the bottom, the bucket that comes on the bottom of it, they made a little plastic one, but they could have actually made it out of wood and extended the control panel out. I think that for the guys that are making aftermarket decks, plates, they could easily just make it a little wider, and so that your hand has a little bit more space to fit as you play. But there's absolutely no way that they can move the joysticks out further without cutting out the sides and extending it out further, and that kind of ruins the design where they want to rack these side by side. So the emulation's fine. I like a lot of the aesthetics, the art, everything that they use was pretty well done, and the scale there. The thing that I do have a problem with is some of the controls. They chose to go with a Sanwa type. Obviously this is a Chinese clone of the Sanwa type, but here you have a 1/2 inch control panel, the deck plate, yet they use these Japanese style small shaft, small motion joysticks, and these weren't really designed for wood control panels. These are designed for metal control panels. Other parts of this video, they're going to see a Japanese LCD, my Clonier, and it has Sanwas in there, and they fit fine, but they're meant to be bolted onto a deck plate that is much thinner than this, than a wood top. Whereas Western machines commonly were made out of wood, some metal control panels, but a lot of them were made out of wood. And so having a bat top, which is designed for wood with a longer shaft and bigger motions, makes sense. But when you stick this Japanese style in here and even extend the shaft to make it ride properly, and then a lot of people are buying these little bat tops to stick on there, there's something odd about the geometry that doesn't work for me. I play fine on my Clonier and other Sanwa type lap joysticks or console joysticks, and I can switch between a Western style HAP or IL Industries Lorenzo, which is this joystick that I modified to fit in there. It's one of these. This is their competition stick, and this is the true IL stick. This isn't the HAP Chinese clone. HAP Controls did clone it in China, but this is the IL one, and they are better. They have nylon bottoms instead of some PVC or other types of plastic, but the parts that they choose, the types of cherry switches, they're smoother, they're nicer, they feel more accurate, and the weight of the micro switch is just right. So the design decision for Arcade1Up to put this type of joystick in there, it's a little bit odd. The geometry doesn't really work for me. I can get most of the moves off, but I have a lower sense of accuracy because there's something just odd, and I think it has to do with the geometry of them extending the joystick to make it fit properly. The buttons, they use these Baolian buttons, and they look virtually the same. They have a slightly different feel. I would say that the tops are a little bit sharper in some ways than the IL or HAP classic buttons. Here I have the HAP buttons on this side, and here I have the Baolian. You don't have a weighted click on the micro switch. These do have micro switches on the bottom of them, but they're softer and they lack the click. And here you have more of a snap response with the proper weighted cherry switch in there. When I modified this, I had to cut a portion of the joystick out. I had to shave maybe 3 3/16 of an inch in this corner and then in the middle, because it actually is centered so close to the two buttons here that the mounting base of the joystick actually it's interfering with the button location. So by shaving a little notch out of it, you can actually get these to fit. So that's the first modification that I did. I also have changed the deck screws to a black button cap hex head that fits in there, and I think it looks a lot nicer than the little steel ones. And they're all little cosmetic things, but only the controls were something that's legit. I have other things planned. I have a RetroPie that I'm going to stick in here, but I thought the emulation was fine. It works great. And so the one thing that I will point out is because their monitor is an LCD and it doesn't have the built-in scan lines of a normal CRT monitor or the classic arcade monitor, it looks a lot pixelated. And in software you can emulate the scan lines. It does take up a little couple of clock cycles on the computer, but it's worth it. And you're going to see in some of my my LCD machine that I show you that it does look closer to the arcade because of that. So this is the monitor that I have. I'm setting up to put into the 1UP Arcade. It is a Dell 20-inch monitor. I have a Raspberry Pi outputting to it with scan lines emulated, and I think it looks really good. I think it pretty well matches the original CRT CGA monitor. The speed on this RetroPie is really good. I have Third Strike also that I've tested, and I think it's a really good representation that'll match well with the original hardware, even though everything's pretty much kind of emulated with modern stuff. And this modification's due to come in like next week, and then I'll finish up the controls, rewire everything with sound. I have an amplifier that I'm going to run into the speaker. I need to figure out how I'm going to run this in stereo into a single speaker, so I might have to get another speaker and hook up two speakers somewhere. So this is part of the video where I wanted to do a comparison of the attract mode from the different examples that I'm presenting. Here's the original, and I think it looks obviously the best because this is how it's meant to be, but the scan lines, the way that the original low resolution drawings and artwork, it's just what we're used to. So this is our baseline comparison. In this example, the Xbox is outputting in higher resolution, but the original artwork was still the same resolution. But what I find is this higher resolution output combined with just the nature way that the scan lines are built into this VGA monitor, it seemed softer to me, and the pixels just seemed less obvious once it got going. It's harder to show on the video here because of the glare on the top plexiglass above the monitor, as well as just the way that the camera was picking things up. So this is straight video of the 20-inch monitor. And I think that it looks the closest to the native CRT monitor with the original hardware in these examples. I think the colors popped just as well as on the original monitor. And soon after, you're going to see the direct comparison of stills of the character selection screen. And this is the Arcade1Up. I think it's slightly out of focus. It looks softer than what it does when you're playing it, and the pixels are quite obvious. But once you're playing the game and things are moving pretty fast, you pretty much don't notice it. It's things like the attract mode, things like the backgrounds that you really start to notice that it does look quite different from the original. And the fact that you're right up against this monitor, you're really close to it. That has to do with the scale of the machine and how they present the monitor. It's not further back, it's right up against the front acrylic plexiglass cover. Here I have 4 stills of the character selection screen. The original, my Xbox, see how it's a little bit softer? The LCD, and the Arcade1Up. So I want to put together my concluding thoughts on the Arcade1Up machine. I've gone over a bunch of stuff. I've done a lot of comparisons to the machines, and I think that what they did overall is a great thing. It may cater to a different audience than me because I have access to arcade machines. I know how to work on them. I restore them. So I've collected arcade machines for far less than what they charge here, even back in the day. And for me, that's accessible. For their target audience, I think what they did with this is a great thing. I think that there are a lot of improvements that could have been made to it. They might have been able to change some things and make some adjustments. And if I had worked on this project, I would have argued for 3 things to be done better. I would have argued for the controls to be slightly different, and I had gone over the difference between the bat top and the ball top and how they kind of picked the wrong style joystick to fit in there. I know why they did it, but I would have done things a little bit different because it would have played completely different if it had a bat top for me. The controls are one thing. The monitor, I spoke at length, and I explained the differences between this LCD and the CRT, or how the look differs. Scan lines without, I've shown everything. So that's one thing. Once it gets going, the game looks crisp. The colors pop. So you're not going to really notice those things. So arguably, does it really need those? No. But is it true to arcade experience? Not for me, but it'll be probably fine for most people. So that's another thing. So that's fine. The biggest thing is really kind of game selection. And they picked 3 games for this collection, and obviously they had to license them from Capcom. And so whenever things go into licensing, you never know how things will go. You don't know what is the required sign-off for which version or whatnot. And maybe they only had only a budget. Memory and footprint, 3 ROMs, they could have done 5 ROMs, 10 ROMs, whatever, and it wouldn't really change the production budget of the hardware at all, really, because these ROMs are so small. And actually, the difference between CE and Hyper Fighting is just 3 chips, which really, it wouldn't have even made any difference at all. So it fell apart in licensing. They could have done more games, but you never know how the deal was structured. And if you can only have 3 games to license, I wouldn't have picked these 3. For me, they hit 1 out of 3 right. And what's woefully missing is really Hyper Fighting. And I get why they probably picked CE. They wanted a slower version that was more of an entry point for more casual players. They didn't want them to be held up by the speed, probably. And World Warrior would have been an obvious choice because it is the first one of Street Fighter II, of the modern era of the fighting game. But World Warrior has a lot of problems. You can't even play Guile versus Guile. You can't play the boss character, so it's missing 4 characters and a true versus mode, which was fixed in CE. But between CE and Hyper Fighting, it's such a small difference, and Hyper Fighting is better balanced, and it has the speed that you really kind of need to match with really kind of modern fighters of the current batch of where fighting games are with the speed of the game. Hyper Fighting is the right version there, and it's more competitive. CAX actually holds a hyper fighting tournament in most years. It's a local arcade collectors convention, and they have a Street Fighter tournament, and they don't want to cater towards the Evolution crowd, the competitive crowd, where it would have been Super Turbo, Third Strike, Street Fighter 4, one of those versions. They wanted something classic that everybody could play, and they picked hyper fighting, and it is the right choice for them. For me, my favorite 3 versions are Hyper Fighting, Super Turbo, and Third Strike. Third Strike would have restructured the whole game completely. It's Street Fighter 3. It wouldn't have been a more classic Street Fighter 2 collection, but it would have been a really great Street Fighter collection. Hyper Fighting Third Strike was one direction. There's some people that like the versus games or Alpha, and a lot of things changed between which branch and which family you kind of go with the fighting game community, and you could have gone all over the place. And they could have actually had one machine that had all the Street Fighter versions, but they probably want to stagger these out and put these out in different versions. There's going to be maybe a Street Fighter 3 machine. There's probably going to be an Alpha machine. There's probably going to be a Marvel vs. Capcom, or there is a Marvel vs. Capcom, but there's probably going to be a Marvel vs. SNK version. And so there will be different versions probably down the road for 1UP, and maybe they have plans for that, and they want to give that more limited small collection so that they can reissue these into different families of the Street Fighter. So I get that also, but for me, I really wish that they had a different collection of games in here. But still, they did a great job, and for most people, the people that this is targeted for, they're going to really enjoy it. And if they have the ability to modify them, or if they're more of a fighting game community as true Street Fighter, they're going to want to change the controls and make some of those modifications. And you can go to town on this machine. You can re-gut this, upgrade it to 20-inch monitor, get the right controls in there. I've seen people put a fridge in the front of this thing, lighted marquee, all sorts of stuff. But for where it is as a base machine, it's a really nice starting point. And like I said, it's a C+, B- for me. But for other people, they may not know the control differences. They might not even have even played it in the arcade ever. They won't even notice maybe, and it will still be a great machine for them. So thanks for watching this very long video.